Hello, I hope you are all doing well. This will be a relatively brief lesson, really starting the conversation that we'll be having over the next week or so related to this idea of ableism. I hope that if you have not gotten a chance to read the introduction in your text, that you will do so. In addition to the subsequent chapters that really begin to pull back the layers and to contextualize this idea of ableism and disability oppression within a historical framework, which we know from previous class discussions that it's always important that we really understand context and that we understand how systems of oppression are really systematic in some ways, based on the ways in which we operate and function in society, what we deem as being the standard or being the norm, versus different identities that we consider to be less than or inferior. So this lesson will give us a broad introduction and sort of lay some groundwork. And of course, we'll continue the discussion on Friday. So in the literature, ableism and disability oppression are often used interchangeably. And it really refers to this all-encompassing system of discrimination and exclusion of people living with disabilities. And of course, throughout the semester, we're really focusing on the ways that oppression is perpetuated within the context of the U.S. And so similar to other forms of oppression that we've talked about this semester, racism, sexism, classism, etc., ableism and disability oppression also occurs on multiple levels, those being individually, culturally, as well as institutionally, to really benefit people who are presently or temporarily able-bodied, and disadvantage the people who are not. And these multiple levels in which oppression occurs, they really reinforce one another. So obviously, when we think about the ways that ableism or disability oppression manifests interpersonally or individually, this relates to individual attitudes or biases, assumptions, etc., that individual people might have, discriminatory acts that people might perpetuate in their day-to-day lives, and how that impacts people on a very individual level. But our individual biases also impacts the way that our culture is structured. Different ideas, different opinions and perspectives that we hold as a culture about what is considered beautiful, what is considered to be healthy, what is considered to be or to have a certain quality of life. And then what happens culturally also reinforces what happens institutionally. So what we deem acceptable as a culture then translates into different policies that are established or not established, that impact people living with disabilities in very marginalizing ways. And then that privileges those who are currently able-bodied. And so it really perpetuates division, and really upholds these certain standards that we have in society about what we deem to be acceptable versus what we deem to be unacceptable. So according to the Americans with Disability Acts of 1990 and then amended in 2008, A disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, such as walking, seeing, hearing, learning, speaking, breathing, standing, lifting, or caring for oneself. Disability is a human condition that is multifaceted and multidimensional and can impact people's lives in very unique ways. About 15% of the world's population, which is over 1 billion people, live with some type of disability. Between 110 million and 190 million live with significant difficulties in functioning. And so from this perspective, people living with disabilities really do represent the largest minority. And I think we also have very specific ideas about disability. I think more often than not, we think about disabilities that are visible to the eye. We think about physical types of disabilities. But people with disabilities are an incredibly heterogeneous group, which we'll talk about in the next slide or so. But we have our own assumptions around what we believe to be a disability. But our perspective, our frame, does not mean that there aren't other types of disabilities that exist that might not fit our very sometimes closed-minded frame of thinking about how that actually looks. This is an issue that massively impacts people across the globe. And I think it's important that we really be deliberate about understanding how complex and how nuanced disability can really be. So despite having federal laws like the ADA or the Americans Disability Act amendments, or even the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act here in the U.S., obviously individuals living with disabilities face real and systemic oppression, specifically within the context of the U.S. The stigma attached to people with disabilities results from and is also perpetuated by stereotypical beliefs, invisibility, lack of inclusiveness, as well as lack of supports. Again, thinking about this sort of erasure that happens where people just feel excluded from society. They feel invisible because of multiple forms of oppression and discrimination in regards to not having access to certain spaces, not having access to certain buildings, or so on and so forth. Just ways in which we fail to acknowledge the disabilities that people have and how that impacts their lives in very tangible ways. Like, not acknowledging those things really results in this experience of feeling completely invisible or included in society. But people with disabilities from across the globe also deal with inadequate communication, transportation, education, daily living needs, funding, timely provision of access, service delivery, as well as numerous other challenges. It's important, again, that we not oversimplify the needs of people living with disabilities and understand how incredibly different and the significant heterogeneity that exists within this group. So again, thinking back to what are the assumptions that we hold, even around like what it means to have a disability, because sometimes we can have very rigid understandings of what that looks like. And in doing so, we might be overlooking an entire group of people simply because they don't fit the narrative that we hold around disability. Historically, disability was perceived through a religious lens and considered an unchangeable condition resulting from sinful behaviors. And again, it's important that we situate disability within this larger context to understand how different forms of oppression, to understand how different forms of discrimination have existed across generations, even until today, how these things have persisted. It's not just like these things aren't just a part of society because they just are. No, there's actually a very long history within our country and abroad of people being marginalized in a lot of instances that has persisted even still until today, unfortunately. In Western societies, infants with disabilities were killed in some instances, and children were abandoned by their families and forced to live on the streets to really fend for themselves and to really try to survive and take care of themselves with little to no support from family or from society. The term handicapped, which is no longer an appropriate term to use, originated in England and was used to describe people with disabilities who use their cap in hand to beg for money on street corners. Others were also placed in jails or asylums facing inhumane treatment. And we, of course, are still grappling with this today. We know that mental illness also falls within the realm of disability oppression and ableism, and the ways in which our prison system, specifically in the U.S. today, in some ways has become this new form of institutionalizing people struggling with mental illness and disability. By the 18th century, people with disabilities were seen as freaks, monsters, and less than human. Freak shows became a form of entertainment in Europe and in the U.S. and became one of the few ways people with severe disabilities could even earn a living. So thinking about people who were living with some form of significant physical impairment, and how they were really exploited to enter different forms of entertainment. We can think about examples of like state fairs and even like circus venues who would travel the country and like literally employ individuals who had some form of disability solely for entertainment. And so when we think about like how incredibly objectifying that is for a person, and these aren't things that, are in the, I'm not talking about things that happened like 20, 30 years ago. These are things that continue to happen on a very frequent basis, unfortunately. So at this point, I'm going to ask that you actually pause the video, and there are 2 YouTube videos posted in your ELC module. They're each about 4 to 5 minutes long. So you're going to watch both of those and then resume this video. These are some key questions that I want you to focus on in relation to the videos that you watched. So write your responses down to each of these questions, and then on Friday, we'll have some conversation. That's it for now. I hope you have a great rest of the week, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.